Hello, I'm Roberta. Thank you for joining me. Who are you going to be is a question adults often ask of children. But perhaps these days, as you look in the mirror or as you see yourself reflected from a computer screen, you are asking yourself, is this really me? And if so, could I be different? And I'm not just talking about the longed for haircuts that many of us are still queuing up for. Who are you going to be is a question not just for children, but for all of us. And the recent drastic changes in circumstances brought about by COVID-19 have brought this question to the fore. Who are we going to be now in these situations? What are we going to let these difficult circumstances make of us? As Christchurch in Ilkley, we've been studying the book of Ruth from the Bible over the past few weeks. I think the story of Ruth gives us good material to think about this question. Who are we going to be? My grandmother from Scotland taught me the story of Ruth, and in fact it was one of the first stories I learned, and it, in a way, fed into who I wanted to be. Because my grandmother told me that her sister, my great aunt, was called Ruth, and that I'd been given my middle name after my aunt. So my name is Roberta Ruth. And my grandmother told me the story of how Ruth in the Bible had been especially loyal to her mother-in-law, Naomi. She contrasted this with Orpah, who doesn't stay with Naomi but goes home, whereas Ruth stuck with her mother-in-law. And that for me became what Ruths do. Ruths are loyal. Ruths commit themselves to God and to God's people. Great as Ruth's loyalty is to Naomi, that's only chapter 1 of the book of Ruth. There's a great deal more to the whole book, and names and their meaning are important across the book. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, his name means God is king. Naomi's sons' names possibly mean sickness and wasting, and give us a hint of what's going to happen to them as they become ill and die at a quite young age. And they leave Orpah and Ruth as widows. Naomi's own name means pleasant, but towards the end of chapter 1, when she's returned home to Bethlehem, she tells the women in the town to call her Mara, which means bitter, because she feels that God has dealt bitterly with her because her husband and sons have died. And Ruth, well, her name means companion or friend, again pointing back to her loyal nature. Boaz, the man who will rescue Ruth and Naomi from poverty, his name means in strength. So the names of the characters underline the actions in the story. The first Hebrew readers and hearers of this story would really have got the message about good ways to act in the most difficult of circumstances. And what about the action? Well, we know that at one level the book is about survival. Widowed Ruth and Naomi have to repeatedly find ways to survive. They return to Bethlehem because they've heard there's a good harvest there. Ruth picks up leftover grain in the fields at harvest time. And then in chapter 3, the plot thickens. Naomi sends Ruth to surprise Boaz in the dark of the threshing floor, where the crops are being processed. Ruth goes and lies down after dark at Boaz's feet. And when he wakes up in the middle of the night, he gets a surprise and he says, "Who are you?" And Ruth replies in chapter 3, verse 9, "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." And we read in the Bible that Boaz answers her, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. The kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier." This conversation is particularly striking because of all the possible answers that Ruth could have given to the question, "Who are you?" and that she doesn't give. Because she could have replied, "I'm poor, hungry, foreign, a widow, vulnerable and out of place. Instead, she simply says, I am Ruth, your servant. And then she adds, I'd like you to act as kinsman redeemer. I'd like you to grant me your protection. Marry me, in other words. And Boaz is impressed by her courage and her loyalty and her goodness that is well known across the time. Ruth's story points to the precariousness and difficulties of human existence and to the presence of God even in the most difficult of circumstances. Ruth, facing all the pain of hunger, bereavement, loss of home and family, threats of all kinds, Ruth steps up. She lives into her name of friend. She chooses God and God's life. And what about us? What about us living through the worst crisis of the last 75 years or so? Who are we going to be? What steps will we take? Well, I want to finish this reflection by sharing the story of Oprah Winfrey. She was raised in very difficult circumstances, in poverty. Her grandmother looked after her when her mother went off to look for work. Her grandmother taught her how to read, and the Bible was the first book that she read. When her grandmother became ill, she went to stay with her mother. And of course, I should say to you that her name, Oprah, is a mispronunciation of Orpah from this very story. So she has a connection to the story of Ruth. Sadly, when Oprah was being looked after in her mother's household, she was mistreated very badly by some of her relatives. When she was 14, she gave birth to a baby who died very soon afterwards. Out of all these circumstances, Oprah kept reading and learning, and she, of course, very famously developed a career as a talk show host. She went on to run her own TV show, which, in her own words, produced some of the most difficult of times. In an interview, she said of her TV network, "It was struggling. I literally had a come to Jesus meeting with myself to say, 'Lord, what would you have me do?'" And she went on to add, "What I know for sure is that the only way to hold on to yourself is through a spiritual base. Otherwise, you lose it." A spiritual base is what brought Ruth through poverty and insecurity. It helped make her who she was and secured her legacy, a legacy that meant in future generations there would be King David. And as we read in the New Testament, in the Gospels, she is named as one of the ancestors in the family of Jesus. Who are we going to be? What story will be told of us? Thank you for joining me.